paradigms up and running in our lab, and also focusing on fiber photometry and getting some recordings going. So to give you some context, I'm going to be talking about these nigrostriatal pathways and how they change during habit formation. So the reason that I'm looking into this project and where this really comes from is during her postdoc, Dr. Lerner was able to delineate these two different populations of neurons in the substantia nigra based on their projection targets. So she looked at projections from the substantia nigra to the dorsal medial stratum and the dorsal lateral stratum, and found that they differed both in their electrophysiological properties as well as their response to various stimuli. And so moving forward, we really wanted to look at these two distinct populations of neurons and see how they were involved in different behavioral paradigms. And so what I'm really focusing on here is habit formation and how these neurons change as we go from a goal-directed behavior to something that's more habitual. So to do this, I'm going to be using fiber photometry. And so I start with DAC-Cree mice here. And then the first thing I do is I'm going to inject a Cree-dependent G-camp into the substantia nigra. And so this is going to allow me to image for calcium imaging. And I'm specifically going to be looking at the projection from the SNC to either the dorsal medial stratum or the dorsal lateral stratum. And then I do place a probe in these locations there so that I'm imaging essentially from these projections, looking at those axon terminals there. And for those who are unfamiliar with calcium imaging, essentially I'm looking at the changes in fluorescence, which show me how the binding of calcium is changing in these projection neurons, which is giving me a proxy for how the neural activity is changing. So that's essentially the information that we're gathering. And I do want to note that in every animal, they have both a probe in the DMS and the DLS on opposite sides, and that's counterbalanced. So we do have a nice kind of internal control there that we're measuring from both projection-defined pathways in one animal. So, as I mentioned, I'm looking at a habitual paradigm. So to give you a little bit of an example of what we're thinking about here, we're looking at something that starts as a goal-directed action and then becomes more stimulus-related. And so as an example, I have a 3.5-year-old daughter, and over the summer we potty trained her. So to get her interested and going after that, to perform the action, our outcome was using like little M&Ms, which 3-year-olds love. So she was all about getting that reward. But then obviously over time, she doesn't need that reward every time. And so now it's shifted to when she has that stimulus, needing to go to the bathroom, she performs that response without needing an M&M. And hopefully it's a habit that sticks for life. So we have a similar concept behind our behavioral paradigm here, and that the animal is going to be placed into an operant box, and they have 2 nose pokes presented to them and a port in the middle where a reward will be placed. So essentially, if the animal nose pokes on the activated side, they'll earn themselves a reward, not unlike an M&M. They can eat that, and then they can try again. If they go to the inactive side, then they will not receive any reward. And so they learn to respond here. Now this is the basic kind of setup of our behavioral paradigm, but to change how they're responding and to really get that habit to form, we're going to change the contingency of what they need to do to earn that reward. And I'll go over that in our timeline here. So initially, after the surgery, and we allow 3 weeks for them to recover, I remove their food to get them motivated to actually perform this task. And then we habituate them to the patch cords. I'll mention that just because it's very important. If we do not do that, then they're like, I'm not nose poking. Then we perform magazine training. So essentially at this point, the animal is placed into the operant box, and then they're going to receive pellets on no contingency. So they don't have to do anything. It's just teaching them where they'll need to go to actually get that reward. So where is the port? Then we're going to take them through FR1 training. So this is the most basic form of the training, and this is what I essentially showed you on that last slide. So all the animal has to do is nose poke 1 time, and they'll earn themselves a pellet. So you can see that's these couple days right here. The criterion is that they need to earn 30 pellets within an hour, and usually they can pick that up within 2 to 3 days. It doesn't take them too long to figure that out. Then moving forward, I do 2 to 3 days of RI30, and this is a random interval schedule. So as I mentioned previously, they just had to nose poke once, they get their reward. Now we've introduced a random time component. And so they're going to need to wait on average 30 seconds to get their reward. They can nose poke as much as they want during those 30 seconds, but it won't change anything. They need to wait that time period. And it does rotate, so it's not always 30 seconds, but that's the average. And you can see they start to increase their nose poking a bit more there. The idea being that there's this level of uncertainty now, right? So they don't know exactly when it's going to occur, where that time period's going to be up. And then next we move into 1 to 2 days of RI60, which is the same concept, but the average is going to be every 60 seconds they're able to earn a reward. Then I perform a shock probe, which I will describe in detail in a few slides here, but essentially this is going to be used to check and see, are they still goal-directed or are they looking more habitual? Where are they at kind of in that realm? Then I'm going to do more RI60 training. I do about 11 days. And then a second shock probe to compare at an early time point and a late time point. And today, I'm mostly going to be talking about this time point here and this one here. We take them out. These are the days that I would actually record, so I get an early RI60 time point, a mid RI60 time point, and then a late RI60 time point to see how these signals are changing as they progress through this task. So we'll start here with our early RI60 information. So to orient you to what we're looking at here, this is going to be those signals that we're recording during either a rewarded or an unrewarded nose poke, and this is during that early RI60 session, so it's either day 1 or 2, so they're still kind of new to the task. And these are in neurons that project from the SNC, so substantia nigra, these dopaminergic neurons, to the dorsal medial striatum. Time 0 here is going to be when they actually nose poke. And then our dark red here is our rewarded and our light kind of orange there is unrewarded. So what we see right away is that when we have this rewarded nose poke, we see this nice response from these DMS projecting neurons. However, when we have an unrewarded nose poke, we don't see that same response. So it appears that these neurons are able to delineate when there is a reward present or when they've earned a reward and when they haven't. In contrast, these are the neurons that project from the substantia nigra to the DLS. We see definitely these are, you'll note the same scale there, so it's a smaller signal. We can talk about that more, but these also seem to be able to differentiate between a rewarded and an unrewarded nose poke. Now, in contrast, we'll look here. This is a rewarded versus an unrewarded port entry. So previously we were just looking at when they put their nose in, but that's not where they're getting the reward. They then have to walk over to the port and get their little pellet. So this is again those DMS projecting neurons. We see this nice response to the rewarded port entry and a lack of a response from an unrewarded port entry. So again, these are able to differentiate. And over here, in contrast, we're looking at those DLS projecting neurons. And this is the one that pretty much that shows kind of the least difference in terms of being able to differentiate between a rewarded and an unrewarded port entry. And I think this is really interesting and something we want to probe further and definitely see how that changes or doesn't change over time, because when you think about it, the way that we're thinking about habit is that they're no longer really focused on the reward that they got, right? By the time they're habitual, they're not really interested in that actual reward. It's just the response that they're giving. And here, this is when they're going into the port. And it seems like these neurons that project to the DLS, at least in some regard, aren't differentiating as strongly between when it's rewarded and unrewarded. So either way, they're kind of firing in response to entering that port, which would make sense for continuing a habitual behavior, even in the face of not having a reward. So that could be something that we would like to look into further. We'll see. So then I'll describe our shock probe and show you the data from that, and this is just the first shock probe. So classically with habit, you do things like satiate the animal and then see how they respond. But there's a lot of variability that comes with that in terms of the concept of satiation, and I just found a lot of difficulties with that specific kind of paradigm. So I created this shock paradigm, which is essentially looking at how an animal responds in the face of consequences. And we know that this is something that is inhibited or is affected later on when someone has formed a habit. So think about something like addiction. Even though someone has lost their job and their friends and are going through all these, they're getting this negative feedback, they still continue with that habit. And you can think of kind of that for lots of different habits. Even when you get negative feedback, you continue. So that's what we're testing here. So it's going to be really similar to the FR1. The animal can nose poke on that side that's active, and they'll get a reward. And they can go eat that. But every once in a while, on average, after every 3 rewards earned, they're going to get a foot shock along with that reward. So essentially, looking at this idea of now they're getting this negative feedback, are they going to change their behavior and think, okay, well sometimes I get a foot shock, so I'll reduce my nose poking and trying to earn these rewards, or I'll continue on with this behavior. And this session also lasts an hour, and the shock is only a second long, and for context, it's 0.2 milliamps. It's a pretty mild foot shock. I don't see like a yelp, or I don't hear a yelp. I don't see any responses. Ideally thinking that hopefully it's more just annoying than actually physically painful. So to show you guys quickly, the kind of idea here, this is after the first shock session versus the second over time. And so we definitely see some differences. I have the percent change over here to kind of give you a better idea. So this one here, you can see during that first session, those animals are still really reducing their responding, whereas by the time they get to that second probe later on, we don't see that same decrease. They seem to be kind of staying the same. And then by the time we get to the end, we actually see kind of an uptick here in that second probe where we're kind of returning that response. And this is actually, I'll go through this really quickly because this is kind of the only difference that we see. So how I've plotted this is rewarded nose pokes during the RI60 versus during the shock. And we can see in these DMS projecting neurons that the signal decreases when they have the shocks. And I'll note that these are rewarded nose pokes that aren't paired with a shock. These are just rewarded nose pokes. But the fact that they are now going through the session where it's sometimes paired with a shock is changing the way they're encoding the value in some way. But that's the only place that we really see differences. So with our unrewarded nose pokes, they look pretty much the same. Rewarded port entries look the same as do unrewarded port entries. So we can talk kind of if anyone has any questions about why that might be. But just for further, our next thing is kind of just getting those late sessions and seeing how these signals may change or stay the same and figuring out what that might mean. So I'd like to thank the Learner Lab, Dr. Talia Lerner, our grad students, and tech, and then the funding there.
Okay, we have time for a couple of quick questions. Yeah.
Just a curiosity, mostly. It's when the animals do, particularly with the shock, are they food deprived or not?
They are food deprived. Yep, they're food deprived throughout the entire task.
Okay. And the other thing is, you said that they get the shock along with the reward. They don't get the shock instead of the reward.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
Okay.
And
is there a reason why you keep it along with the reward?
Yeah, so the idea there is that they're still getting the thing that they're going after, but it's just now paired with this aversive stimuli to see if that changes how they're valuing the reward, to see if they want to reduce it or not. Yep.
I noticed in DLS that the kinetics of the signal seems to be much more prolonged.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts about that?
No, we're not. I mean, in terms of why, but I think that kind of, because the time scale there is pretty long. I mean, that's like 5 to 10 seconds there that it's shown. Would be a really interesting signal to manipulate optogenetically because of how long it's kind of lasting after that, and seeing why maybe that signal is so prolonged compared to the DMS, which just kind of has this quick turn off there.
Have you actually measured dopamine level?
No, we have not, in terms of like with
D-Light, for example?
No, but we do kind of have the setup now to be able to do that, so we're piloting some things with D-Light, and we have a new photometry system to be able to do essentially the D-Light with an R-camp, and then also get the baseline too.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. So the next talk is, I just realized actually I cannot pronounce, or I don't know how to pronounce your surname.
Eiselstein.